10 years ago, I bought a PS3 just to play The Last of Us. I went on to use it to play Demon's Souls and plenty of other exclusives that had passed me by, but the one that convinced me to drop my money on a console, the one that I really didn't want to miss out on, was The Last of Us. The reason I'm mentioning this is to get across what a capital B big deal this game felt like at the time. Releasing right at the end of the PS3's life cycle, The Last of Us promised to represent the absolute bleeding edge of game design in 2013, in graphics, gameplay, immersion, storytelling, the whole 9 yards. The trailer I'm showing now from E3 2012 may look like nothing special today, but it got me seriously excited at the time, and it showcased a level of emergent gameplay that felt unprecedented. When the game finally came out, it felt like everyone was talking about it, and everyone had an opinion, especially regarding the ending. As for whether it lived up to the enormous hype that had been generated for it, the general consensus at the time was yes it did. Although the claim some were making that it was the Citizen Kane of gaming is plainly very stupid. Because Outer Wilds is the Citizen Kane of gaming, obviously. While I did enjoy my first playthrough of The Last of Us back then, I can remember thinking even at the time that it didn't actually do anything particularly new. Where it did succeed, however, was in crystallizing the major trends in AAA games of that generation into one highly polished experience. Cover shooting from behind waist-high walls? Check. Seamless transitions between stealth and gunfights? Check. Plot tightly focused on the relationship between two characters? Check. Light resource gathering and crafting mechanics to encourage exploration? Big check. Notes left lying around to provide some environmental storytelling? You better believe that's a check. I could go on. The only serious competition it had for Game of the Year lists was GTA 5, and considering the microtransaction-riddled mess of a cash cow that turned into, I can find a lot to respect in the smaller scope and compact pacing of The Last of Us. But anyway, that was all 10 years ago, and things are a little different now. Since then, we've seen a sequel, a prestige TV series, and even the announcement of an as-yet untitled multiplayer live service game. I shudder at the thought. It seems that Naughty Dog now has a cash cow of their own. And of course, there's the subject of this video, a remake of the first game, now renamed as The Last of Us Part 1. Inferring, as I think everyone else is, that there will eventually be a Last of Us Part 3 to conclude the story, then this is a remake of the first game in a series that isn't even finished yet, and I think a few words attempting to explain this apparent waste of developer resources are justified. Back in the days of Crash Bandicoot, Jak and Daxter, and even with Uncharted on the PS Triple, Naughty Dog was able to squeeze out whole trilogies on a single console. Nowadays, games on their scale and budget take so long to make that they will likely never get back to that level of output, and with 7 years passing between the release of parts 1 and 2 of The Last of Us, they were only months away from skipping an entire console generation altogether. Assuming Part 3 has an equally long development time, anyone wanting to play through the whole trilogy down the line would potentially need to dig out 3 separate consoles in order to do so. With that in mind, I can understand Sony and Naughty Dog's decision to remaster and remake Part 1 for newer hardware, and it probably doesn't hurt that the PC release was around the same time as their TV adaptation either. In fact, with Sony releasing most of their major console exclusives on PC, I'm 90% sure they're preparing for this to be the last generation of consoles before they and Microsoft both move to cloud streaming services. By the time The Last of Us Part 3 does release, the whole trilogy will likely be available in one place, and whether that's on Steam or on some rival service run by Sony, getting ahead of the curve now is a forward-thinking move on their part. So, with its existence vindicated, I'll be moving on to my critique of The Last of Us Part 1, breaking down what I think are its successes and its failures. But just before I do, a quick word on this game's status as a remake, because not a lot about the original game has been changed. Outside of the obvious graphical upgrade, some enemy behaviours have been improved, I assume to bring them in line with the sequel, which I haven't played yet. On the whole though, playing through this remake will give you more or less the same experience you had with the original game 10 years ago. Whether or not you believe that's worth full price is up to you, and I've done enough complaining about remakes in my recent videos that I don't want to repeat myself here. Finally, you're likely aware that the PC port had a rocky launch, to say the least. I don't want to labour the point too much because I want my videos to be as timeless as possible, and these problems would almost certainly be fixed and become irrelevant in the long run. But it's hard not to see it as a sign of the times, and yet more evidence of the unsustainability of the AAA games industry as of 2023. Alright, enough stalling, let's get into the game. There will be spoilers from here. The premise in The Last of Us is that a fungal parasite, the terrifyingly real cordyceps, has mutated from preying on insects to infecting human hosts, taking over their nervous system and compelling them to spread the fungus to more and more victims. Whether any vestige of the infected person's consciousness persists is an unsettling question left for the player to ponder on their own. 20 years after the civilizational breakdown that follows this outbreak, life is hard, the remnants of government are authoritarian, and people survive however they can. The plot follows the two protagonists, Joel and Ellie, on a continent-spanning journey across the former United States of America, and from the very beginning of development, the intention of the story was to show the growth of their relationship over time, from total strangers to deeply caring for one another. This being a video game, their travels bring them into plenty of encounters with hostile enemies, both human and mycelian, and the player can deploy the typical blend of stealth and combat to make it through. Both the story and the gameplay have a theme of survival then, but while the characters may complain about being hungry or scavenging for food, the player need only concern themselves with finding ammo, crafting resources, and the occasional new weapon. Clearly, realism was the guiding principle for this game's aesthetics, not only in terms of visuals, but in the credibility of the world in general. Early concept art of the infected is a lot more outlandish and supernatural in appearance, and I think the right call was made in going with the more believable designs that we ended up with. An astounding amount of detail is packed into each area in the game, and the player is often rewarded for looking around and taking it in, either with resources or just with some environmental storytelling. It's surely no accident that the game's hardest difficulty is called Grounded mode, but I have some mixed thoughts on all that which I'll get to later. One last thing that's worth bearing in mind when considering the design of this game is that it was made with the aim of appealing to the broadest possible audience in order to recoup the massive production costs, from experienced players to people who barely pick up one game a year. This is an economic reality that I think informed several of the design decisions in the game, and put an upper limit on how much complexity Naughty Dog was comfortable baking into the gameplay, and once again I'll return to this thought later when it's relevant. And with that, I think I've adequately summarised the design goals of The Last of Us, so I'll move on now to breaking down how successfully I think the game achieves those goals, and what better place to start than at the very beginning. Like so many post-apocalyptic stories, this one starts with a glimpse of life before the outbreak. We're introduced to Joel, a single father in Texas just getting by with his daughter Sarah, and in an impressively compact opening scene, we see just enough to get a feel for what their lives and relationship are like. On the whole, throughout the game I think the dialogue and interactions between characters do a lot with a little, and avoid unnecessary exposition by trusting the player to fill in the blanks, a trust that I greatly appreciate. We see Sarah give a birthday gift of a new watch to Joel, and this isn't the last we'll be seeing of it. Unfortunately for these characters, anyone who's noticed that Sarah is not the girl on the box art probably has an inkling that things are soon to take a dire turn. The game's first interactive scene sees the player take control of Sarah on the night of the outbreak, with the option of briefly looking around for a further peek into her life with Joel. When they leave in a car with Joel's brother Tommy, we see through Sarah's eyes a handful of events that quickly give you an idea of the scale of what's happening, until the car is flipped in a crash and the player's control abruptly switches to Joel. After one more set piece to really sell the chaos of the moment, the pair have a run-in with a soldier that has tragically fatal consequences for Sarah. There's a complaint often made about stories that kill off characters early on that the audience hasn't yet had time to care for them, so won't be bothered by their death. The Last of Us proves that trope isn't always the case, and has the confidence to linger almost uncomfortably long on the upsetting image of a man who's just lost everything in a matter of minutes. I'm not sure the word performance is the right one to use here, because Troy Baker's acting in this scene has been augmented by a number of designers and artists, but for want of a better one, the performance is very good. Perhaps a bigger contributing factor to the sympathy the player feels here, however, is that they spent a bit of time playing as Sarah and experiencing her perspective, and became more directly attached to her that way. All that said, while this 15-minute intro is extremely important for the story and the establishment of Joel's character, it is utterly devoid of meaningful gameplay, and after you've seen it once, the ability to skip it by starting a new game directly from the following chapter is a very welcome one. In fact, you can select not only chapters but individual encounters from the menu and jump in at any point, which is an excellent feature that I think deserves a shout out. Just before I move on from this barely interactive first chapter, this seems an appropriate time to bring up the reputation that Naughty Dog has garnered for making so-called movie games, which is not entirely undeserved, but also a little bit unfair. A high number of cutscenes and non-interactive segments might just be a necessary concession for telling a focused story about well-defined characters that the player can't always be in control of. Stealth and combat in a 3D space are easy things to gamify and make interactive, not so much complex emotions and relationships. Naughty Dog makes a valiant attempt at bridging this gap, but given the technology currently available to them, they often have no choice but to fall back on cutscenes to do the job of storytelling. So, jumping forward 20 years, we catch up with Joel in a different life post-apocalypse, working as a smuggler in the Boston quarantine zone alongside Tess, with the exact nature of their relationship left ambiguous. Another great example of the game leaving out the unnecessary and letting the player fill in the blanks. We find them in the middle of trying to recover some stolen goods from a rival called Robert. It's really not important, and it's mostly a thin excuse for some confrontations against human enemies, but not before a quick run-in with a room of infected, finally giving the player their first encounter. And in general, this Boston chapter does a good job at showing the player what the majority of the gameplay will look like. The fact that the very first encounter in the game can be effortlessly completed with stealth, and the second begins with the enemies already aware of you, quickly introduces the player to both extremes of the combat scale in The Last of Us, and after that point, you mostly have the freedom to switch between the two at will. Dishonourable mention goes to this absurd non-encounter on the bridge, where 3 guards stand perfectly still with their backs to you, just waiting to be taken down one by one. I honestly think something about this is broken, and I'm shocked it made it into the game in this state. Any player who doesn't use stealth here is wasting resources for no reason, and over a playthrough you'll come to realise that this silent stealth kill is ridiculously overpowered. The Boston chapter also gives the player their first taste of the endless series of ladders and planks that they'll be interacting with again and again throughout the game, to provide downtime between combat encounters. But that's another thing I'll come back to once we've seen more of them. In terms of story, the upshot here is that the one who ended up with Joel and Tess's stolen goods is Marlene, leader of the Fireflies, a rebel organisation fighting against the military government in the quarantine zones. Before she gives their goods back, Marlene just wants Joel and Tess to smuggle something out of the zone. Actually someone, the teenage girl Ellie, who it soon turns out is immune to the cordyceps infection, making her the most important person on the planet. Cue a stealthy escape from the zone and a detour through a skyscraper, subway and museum all swarming with infected. When the Scooby Gang finally gets to the drop-off point, all the Fireflies there are already dead. Tess reveals she's been bitten, and before sacrificing herself to stall the soldiers pursuing them, she entreats Joel to see this through to the end and get Ellie to wherever the Firefly headquarters are so that they can use her immunity to develop a cure.
There's enough here that you have to feel some sort of obligation to me, so you get her to Tommy's.
Joel's reaction to Tess's death is muted, to say the least, but this is made more believable by the ambiguity about their relationship that I mentioned earlier, and I think we can assume that the last 20 years have turned him into a man completely hardened to the outside world. This is another moment that does a lot with a little. After surviving another subterranean escape and ferrying Ellie across some water using a pallet, the first of no less than 5 instances of this throughout the game, the remaining duo are finally to safety, the lengthy setup that got us to this point is over, and the road trip story that you really came to see finally begins in earnest. After this, the narrative takes on the shape of a series of vignettes for each season of the year, each one ending with something that transforms Joel and Ellie's relationship before cutting to black and abruptly jumping forward in time. You can probably guess by now that I really like these sharp transitions, again because it leaves out the unnecessary logistics of travel and just shows you what you need to know to see the protagonist's relationship evolve towards this tale's conclusion. With the basic structure of the story sketched out, I think now would be a good time to get into what the gameplay actually entails. In The Last of Us, your playthrough will be split between encounters with enemies and the downtime between those encounters that gives you a chance to explore the environment, initiate dialogue with other characters, and gather ammo and crafting resources. I'll start with the combat, which can be split into 2 categories: fights against humans and fights against infected. The Left Behind DLC, which I'll get to at the end of this video, features some encounters with both at once, but it never happens in the base game. The vast majority of combat scenarios start with the enemies unaware of your presence, which means you're pretty much always incentivized to get as much out of stealth as possible in every fight. This is doubly true because stealth kills are free and don't consume any resources, and what's more, they're completely silent. I feel like this was a bit of a misstep because it makes stealth into a clearly dominant strategy. One of the craftable items is shivs, which can be used for a faster stealth kill and break on use, but because they also have the far more valuable use of breaking into storerooms for extra resources and materials, you're going to be saving the shivs and sticking to the chokehold. This choice would have been far more impactful if the shiv was silent but choking wasn't. That way, you would have an actual reason to use resources on a silent kill and might think about it more carefully. As it is now, get used to watching the light fade from an NPC's eyes, because you're going to see it again, and again, and again. There is one infected type, clickers, that actually do require the use of a shiv for a stealth kill, so you need to put some thought into when to sneak past and when to expend resources on taking one out, and I think confrontations with human enemies could have benefited from forcing a similar trade-off. All this talk about shivs and when to use them is slightly undercut when you play as Ellie in the Winter chapter and realise that her knife can be used again and again, even against clickers, with no concern for durability or resources. This may be a nitpick, but surely Joel would have had a chance to pick up a knife of his own at some point in their journey. I still think shiv durability is a good inclusion to the game because it can lead to interesting decisions, but the justification for it is flimsy given that Ellie's knife exists. Anyway, rounding out the melee options, there are a handful of noisier ones you can pick up that also have durability bars to keep an eye on. Blunt weapons need 3 or 4 hits to take down an enemy, whereas bladed ones are an instant kill, but are less durable and only appear halfway into the game. Using the same crafting resources used to make shivs, you can attach temporary blades to a blunt weapon, but I very rarely wanted to craft one of these improvised instant kill weapons because they break after a single use and they override the regular melee attack, meaning that if you do craft it, then you now can't use melee without using, and often wasting, the instant kill attachment you invested resources into. It's a strange case where crafting this item actually reduces the options available to you, and if you ask me, it needed a bit of a rethink. Just for the sake of covering everything, you can also craft proximity activated nail bombs, molotovs and smoke bombs that all provide you with ways of attacking multiple enemies at once, and you can carry one brick or bottle as a get out of jail free card to provide a distraction during stealth or a stun on a nearby enemy. Moving on to the more standard firearms, there are 8 different guns collected over the course of the game, with the bonus 9th right at the very end. I really like the way weapon switching works, where you can have a few equipped at once but need to stay still and open your inventory to scroll through your unequipped ones. It strikes a great balance between having to choose your equipment carefully but also having access to plenty of options at once. Unfortunately, a lot of those options are very similar. The pistol and revolver are both handguns, the rifle and Diablo have the same armor-piercing long-distance use case, and for some reason it was deemed necessary for there to be 2 shotguns in the game. The only silent projectile weapon is the bow, which makes it into a strategic tool that needs to have some thought put into its use. Or I would say that if it wasn't for the fact that you rarely have any reason to use it, because stealth kills are also silent and are already so easy to pull off. By the way, it stretches believability to breaking point how almost every area in the game is littered with obstacles of precisely the same height to duck behind. It's a dead giveaway that combat against humans is coming, whereas encounters with infected aren't signposted quite so obviously. There's a healthy amount of weapon sway that adds to the game's realism and makes long-distance shots with anything other than the rifle or Diablo riskier to pull off, although whether you find this immersive or frustrating will largely come down to how scarce ammo is on the difficulty you're playing. Grabbing a stunned or unaware enemy will also allow you to hold onto them and use them as a shield while firing at other enemies, which is an additional option that spices up combat a bit and gives you a reason to experiment with tactics besides staying in one spot and shooting everyone. On the whole, I think that the player side of the combat equation offers an adequate amount of choices to be made about strategy, but I do find it disappointing how exploitable stealth is, and if I had to guess, which I do, I'd say that this was probably a concession made to achieve Naughty Dog's goal of the broadest possible appeal. Games where the player is constantly losing a vital resource can be stressful enough to turn some players away, and I have no doubt that this was something to be avoided at all costs during development. When it comes to the enemies side of combat, there's not a huge amount of variety, but that's okay because it's usually the layout of the environment that differentiates encounters. Human enemies come in 2 main flavours, ones with guns and ones with makeshift clubs, with the occasional well-prepared opponent kitted out with body armour and a helmet. These humans have a surprisingly strong instinct for self-preservation, and will sometimes wait behind cover for an uncomfortably long time without showing themselves, long enough that you'll really start to second-guess yourself and imagine that they must have moved without you seeing them. While you're locked in one of these peekaboo standoffs, it's shockingly easy to get yourself flanked by another enemy taking advantage of your tunnel vision. Enemies will call out to each other to reveal your position, which is a great touch that adds yet more realism and conveniently lets you know where to move away from to get back into stealth. All of these factors together mean that the strategy of staying in one spot and waiting for enemies to come to you is rarely viable against human enemies, which means that there can be a hell of a lot of tension even against a single foe, as you both try to outwit each other. Unfortunately, there's a feature in the game that completely undermines a lot of the tension and realism established by the combat. Listen mode. I'm really not a fan of this. Giving Joel the superhuman ability of seeing through walls fatally grinds against the believability that every other part of the game works so hard to uphold, and again I have to wonder whether it was included as some kind of concession for less experienced players. It's unavailable on higher difficulties, as it should be, but even when playing on lower ones, I ignored it because I just really don't like it. Aside from the blow it deals to the sense of realism, there's also the fact that it simply makes the game too easy. In a third-person game where you already have the massive advantage of being able to see around corners and over cover, which makes stealth kills in a room with a central obstacle effortless, letting the player see enemies through walls is a step too far for me. If Listen mode was available in the menu as one of Naughty Dog's famous accessibility options, of course I would have no issue with it, but having it available by default on the normal difficulty is a baffling choice to me. Before I get into my thoughts on combat against Infected, I'm going to return to the story and move that along a bit first. Leaving Boston behind after Tess's sacrifice, we catch up to Joel and Ellie on the outskirts of a town that's home to Bill, an old associate that owes Joel a favour, in the hopes of procuring a car that can take them across the country to Tommy, Joel's brother and former Firefly. Already this early on you can see the playful personality of Ellie, as she annoys Joel by trying to whistle, and Joel does show a bit of a softer side here too, but when they find the bow, or more accurately steal Bill's bow, Ellie's request to hold onto it is firmly denied. The scene with the rope trap leads to the first time the player and Joel have to rely on Ellie, and thanks to its interactivity, it might actually have been more effective than the later and more story-crucial moment where something similar happens in a cutscene, but it's not capitalized on here. When the duo meets Bill and Joel suddenly has another character he has to justify his actions to, he sticks up for Ellie a bit, though I think at this point it's more due to the obligation he feels to Tess than to any fondness he has for Ellie. After finally finding the working car and battery they were after, the revelation that the partner Bill mentioned missing earlier is the body hanging in the house is an effective one that's sure to inspire some sympathy for him and his standoffish nature. Because we never see him again after this, I think it's safe to assume a sad ending for Bill, although I suppose everyone in this game's world gets a sad ending. Since every enemy encounter in Bill's town is against Infected, I might as well get into that side of combat now. In most encounters you have the option of starting off with the usual stealth takedowns, and these are even more overpowered against Infected than they are against human enemies, with a lot of them just standing still and not even requiring you to get behind them. If you do get detected or break stealth deliberately, they'll all come charging directly at you and need to get blasted. These fungal friends don't show the same desire for self-preservation that humans do. Almost invariably then, the best strategy to use against aggressive Infected is to stay in one spot behind a bottleneck and pick them off as they come through it, which is why the rare encounter against hordes of them will usually see them pouring in from different directions, so that you're constantly under pressure to keep moving. There are a few different kinds of Infected: the standard runners, clickers who are functionally blind but can sense their surroundings with clicks, stalkers who hide behind cover and try to ambush you, and bloaters, big boys who insta-kill you and suck up a ton of ammo before going down. There isn't really a whole lot of difference between these types, to be honest, and the same strategy will do for all of them except for bloaters. Exposition is provided to justify these different breeds of enemy. Supposedly it's based on how long the fungus has been growing in them, but the more you think about that, the less sense it makes, especially considering their seemingly random placement throughout the world. Naughty Dog probably should have just kept their mouth shut on this one. While I'm nitpicking, I find it hard to believe that Joel wouldn't be exposed to some kind of spore or fluid from all these close-up interactions with Infected, but that's another thing that it's best not to think too hard about. I should mention that clicker behaviour is one thing that's actually been changed for the better in this remake. In the original release, it never really made sense that clickers couldn't see the player. If they're clicking like bats,
Like bats? Like bats.
then surely they should be able to detect you standing or moving near them. In this remake, now they actually can, and you need to avoid being in their line of sound when they do their clicking if you want to remain undetected. Something I noticed in the multiple replays I did for this video is that encounters with infected are mostly front-loaded into the first half of the game. Boston, Billstown, and the suburbs outside Pittsburgh offer entire chapters that are all about dealing with infected, but after that point there are surprisingly few. 0 near the dam, 2 very short sequences in the university, only 1 in the whole of the winter chapter, and then 1 in Salt Lake City before the finale. I suppose this is because the infected may make for suitable enemies in combat, but they're not capable of actually being characters in a story, which the game understandably prioritizes in its latter half. All in all, the combat in The Last of Us definitely has potential, and it realizes that potential more often than not, with most major encounters having something that makes them memorable, and most enemies demanding to be taken seriously. It works best when you have the full range of options at your disposal, using stealth to take down a few enemies before getting spotted and improvising to take out the rest using the resources available to you. But it suffers from streamlining that simplifies things a bit too much and lets you drift towards the same obviously dominant strategies over and over again. There are very occasionally unique events like the spotlight generator in Pittsburgh or the rope trap in Billstown, and I would have liked to have seen more of this kind of thing, but given that the game has to break its own rules and allow the player infinite ammo for this set piece to work, I can understand why the devs shied away from adding more moments like this. It's worth mentioning that NPC companions who join you in stealth will be completely ignored by enemies even if they run in front of them, but that was probably the right call to avoid player frustration, and at least I can say that this happens way less frequently now than it did in the original release. Still, it means it's kind of funny when Joel goes into danger alone to make sure it's safe, because as the player, we know that NPCs are invincible either way. Moving on from Billstown, we're next treated to a cutscene of some more bonding between Joel and Ellie on the road, although her jokes about the magazine she stole from Bill's place seem more intended to make the player like her than Joel. Arriving in Pittsburgh and falling into a trap set by the bandits who've taken over the quarantine zone there, the pair make their way through the city where there's plenty of exposition to be found in the environment about the overthrowing of the zone, and a few optional conversations where you can hear Ellie's bewilderment at the symbols of the society that collapsed before she was born. It's in the hotel in Pittsburgh after the two are separated that Ellie once again saves Joel, but because this scene isn't interactive, I think it's a bit of missed potential, and it loses something over the rope trap from earlier. Despite Joel's initial blustering, he realizes that it's probably a good idea to let Ellie be armed, and in the next scene entrusts her with a rifle from up on the scaffolding. Unfortunately, the encounter that follows is one of the most ham-fisted attempts at merging gameplay and story seen anywhere in this game. Because the cutscene afterwards implies that Ellie fired the rifle at some point, the gameplay section beforehand needs to end in combat for it to make sense. If the player tries to take out all the enemies with stealth, then more will keep appearing to replace them until the player is eventually discovered and Ellie is allowed to fire her rifle. The consistency of the gameplay here is sacrificed for the sake of the story, but it still allows you to believe that you have the option of stealth, which I think shows a shocking disregard for the player's time, considering how easy the fix for this would have been. If the player has no choice, then don't give them the illusion of choice and just start the scene in open combat. Either way, with their relationship further developed and Ellie now armed, the pair escapes a military vehicle that's been commandeered by the bandits and runs into Sam and Henry, who soon try to abandon Joel and give Ellie a chance to show her commitment to him by jumping back down into danger to stay with him. Ellie will now sometimes help you in combat using her new gun, and it can feel surprisingly dynamic and emergent, which is a win in my book since I see that as one of the core promises of the game. I especially like the dialogue the characters have after the first time this happens.
Did you just see me?
That was good.
Well, thank you, Joel.
After one last escape sequence across the bridge, Sam and Henry are back, and the four of them find a way out of Pittsburgh through the sewers. The section down here is probably the highlight of the game in terms of memorable environment design. Clearly some real thought was put into how a community might survive down there. There are tanks for collecting rainwater, bunk beds, a classroom, a play area, sound traps to raise an alarm for intruders, and likely more stuff I didn't notice. This section also has the greatest amount of written notes to be discovered, with the saga of Ish and the downfall of his underground settlement getting quite a lot of detail. While it was hardly a new idea even in 2013, letting the player collect exposition and piece together side stories on their own is a way of leveraging the unique interactive strength of games as a storytelling medium, and I think it deserves a thumbs up. Anyone who doesn't care about any of this stuff technically has the option of barreling straight through and ignoring it, but they'd be missing out on half the game by doing so. Paying attention to the world, uncovering information and fitting it together can be an equally as rewarding part of the experience as surviving a dangerous encounter, and the fact that the characters themselves comment on what they're seeing suggests that the player is definitely supposed to get invested themselves.
Jesus.
Escaping from the sewer, the gang gets some brief respite on a suburban street, which again is one of the highlights of safe exploration areas in the game. If you want to be thorough here, then you could probably spend a good 10 minutes searching through each home for supplies, engaging in multiple optional conversations, boosting Ellie up into the attic of one house, and watching the kids play darts. Each of the non-combat features of the game gets some strong attention here, and it all happens while you have direct control of Joel. Unfortunately, the moment of peace doesn't last long, and jumping down to the next area leads you directly into the path of a sniper from a group of bandits that followed you from Pittsburgh. Even more unfortunately, this scene suffers from the same problem as the one in the city square, namely that it looks like there should be multiple solutions, but the script says that only one is allowed. You can't take care of the sniper from outside his window, you have to go inside his building and up to his room so that he can spawn in from nowhere and initiate a QTE with you, and Joel can grab the rifle himself. In fairness to the remake, it has very slightly improved on the original release by having a light shine at you if you try aiming at the sniper's nest, which at least makes it marginally clearer that you're supposed to try something else. When the military vehicle returns, it's satisfying to finally get to take it down with the rifle after you likely assumed you'd already seen the last of it. The cutscene after the gang's escape sees Sam and Henry exit the story after Sam conceals an infected bite from the rest of the group and has to be put down, leading to the first cut-to-black end-of-season transition in the game. I've praised these enough by now, so I won't repeat myself. I have to say that Sam and Henry don't end up having much of an impact on the story, but we do at least get to see the difference between Joel and Ellie's reactions to their deaths early in the next chapter.
How many times do we need to go over this? Things happen, and we move on.
It's just...
That's enough.
I'll pause the story here for a second to go over the resource mechanics and the difficulty, which are both deeply intertwined in The Last of Us. Besides ammo, through exploration you can collect scrap for upgrading weapons, medicine for upgrading some of Joel's abilities, and crafting resources that can be used to make health kits, throwables, shivs, or melee attachments. It's clear that an effort was made to place these resources in mostly believable locations too, which I think deserves some praise. The fact that some of these craftable items consume the same resources and force you to prioritize which ones you want blew my mind back in 2013, but looking back it's a bit imbalanced and oversimplified to the point where there actually aren't a lot of interesting decisions to make. A health kit is pretty much always going to be more valuable to you than a Molotov. As for upgrading weapons with scrap, I similarly rarely found myself having to make any difficult choices. The most useful upgrade on each weapon by far is the capacity increase, which made it an easy priority for me. Lowering recoil seemed like a waste of resources, as I never had an issue correcting for that myself, and with most weapons powerful enough to stop an enemy in their tracks, or at least stagger them, increasing fire rate didn't really seem worth it either. All of your upgrading is completely irrelevant, however, when you're at the mercy of ammo pickups to actually be able to use any given weapon in the first place. Due to the scarcity of resources, it's impossible to get all the weapon upgrades, but it's also impossible to know which weapons you're going to end up finding ammo for, which means that half the time you wasted your resources on a weapon you can't even use, especially on higher difficulties where ammo is less plentiful. I will say that some of Joel's animations when upgrading weapons are a really immersive touch, although it did make me laugh when he increased the ammo capacity of his shotgun by giving it a wipe. The Last of Us sets itself a higher standard of realism than most games, and I do find the unique animations very impressive, but when the game is unable to meet that high standard every time, the consequences are often unintentionally funny. The amount of resources you can find is predetermined purely by the difficulty you're playing on. On moderate mode, you'll find some pistol ammo in this room. Any mode higher than that, and you wasted your time coming in here. If you're playing on the highest difficulty, grounded, almost every cupboard, drawer and locker you open will be empty, and exploration is more or less a complete waste of time. Instead of making all these resources disappear from the world, I think a better way of upping the difficulty would have been to raise the amount of resources needed to craft items, while also lowering the max number of items you can carry at once. During my playthrough on Grounded, I spent most of the game chronically low on ammo, but never quite empty. That was until I got to one firefight where stealth wasn't an option, with literally zero ammo for any of my guns, and was forced to improvise and get creative with smoke bombs in order to make it through. If I hadn't had those smoke bombs left over, I'm not sure this section would even have been possible to complete. I encountered a similar situation when playing as Ellie in the Winter chapter, when I had almost nothing in the way of resources and had to stumble my way through with explosives and stealth. If my nail bomb didn't have the intended effect of taking out these two enemies, I would just immediately pause and reload the checkpoint because I knew I had no hope of success. Perhaps needless to say, playing this mode didn't feel particularly grounded to me. Getting back to the story, the chapter after Sam and Henry's demise brings us to the dam where Tommy lives, and the community is working on turning it into an electrified settlement. Now convinced of the reality and the importance of Ellie's immunity, Joel wants to hand her over to Tommy and let him take her the rest of the way to the Fireflies, which will soon be a source of conflict when Ellie gets wind of it. Tommy tries to give Joel a picture of him and Sarah that he retrieved from Texas, but Joel refuses it, a revealing choice that shows he's clearly still unable to cope without shutting himself off from the outside world. While I've complimented the story multiple times for often leaving out the unnecessary, I'm not sure the same can always be said of the gameplay, and a bandit attack interrupts the brothers here that I think is a bit redundant. We're supposed to believe that the dam is a safe refuge, yet there are raiders holed up only a minute's horse ride away, and they somehow got pretty far into the dam without any resistance. Once the enemies are dealt with, Ellie realizes that Joel is trying to get rid of her and runs away on a horse. Tommy and Joel follow her tracks, and it leads through a bandit camp that not only feels redundant again, but also makes no sense because Ellie seemingly came through here without being attacked. Catching up with her in the bedroom of a ranch house, the argument between Joel and Ellie here is a high point of the acting performances in the game. I particularly like that the scene begins with Ellie commenting on the girl's diary that she's reading, which offers a great insight into her perspective, having been born after the apocalypse. Without wanting to dwell on this scene too long, it's a convincing, believable dialogue that's well written and superbly acted, and it ends with Joel seemingly having made up his mind to part ways with Ellie.
You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
But then, after killing the last group of raiders that breaks into the ranch, a few minutes later he's done a complete 180 and wants to stay with her.
You know me, my mind's all made up.
In my memory of my original playthrough from 10 years ago, I thought that this argument was what causes Ellie to run away with the horse, and the fight to find her and get her back was what makes Joel realise he doesn't want to leave her after all. But it turns out that actually barely any time at all passes between the argument and Joel changing his mind. Personally, I feel like something is missing here to explain that sudden shift, but maybe that's just me. Either way, now having made up his mind in the opposite direction, Joel travels with Ellie to the university where the Fireflies have their headquarters, and the dialogue between them has evolved to reflect the development of their relationship, with Joel more patient and less cold in response to Ellie's questions.
Were you married?
For a while.
What happened?
Okay.
Too much?
Too much.
We find out that the Fireflies have moved on to a hospital in Salt Lake City, so we have our next breadcrumb. And in case any players were thinking that there hadn't been a combat sequence for a while, a group of hunters breaks into the university and gets between our protagonists and the exit. This encounter ends with Joel falling off a balcony and getting impaled, once again leading to a sequence where he and the player need to rely on Ellie to get them out of there. After escaping the university, we get our second end of season smash cut, as Joel falls off the horse and Ellie scrambles to try and stop him from fading away. I have no doubt that the fact that we immediately cut to playing as Ellie in the next season was intentionally designed to leave the player wondering whether Joel is still alive or not. It turns out he is, but he's on death's door, and with the tables now flipped and Ellie in a protective position over Joel, it's the perfect way to show the next stage in their relationship. While out hunting, Ellie barters for medicine with some men she runs into, and gets caught up in a standoff against a horde of infected with one of them, David. I'm not too sure what the rationale was behind having you buddy up with him like this. Maybe it's to give him some screen time and get the player to build some trust in him. Maybe it's just because it might have seemed unrealistic to have Ellie defeat an entire horde alone. Or maybe it was just so that Nolan North would get some more lines.
You're a better shot with that thing than I am!
It's a great moment when David reveals afterwards that he's from the same group that Joel butchered at the university, and you realise that you weren't imagining it, there definitely is something off about him. He still allows Ellie to leave with the medicine, and after using it to treat Joel's wound, she notices that she's led David's group straight to their hiding spot. Ellie rides away to cause a distraction, which leads to what I think is the longest uninterrupted sequence where you play as her, stealthing and combating your way across a lakeside resort. Shout out to the visuals here, which are pretty nice when they're not making your graphics card explode. Playing as Ellie gives you fewer options than playing as Joel in almost every respect. Fewer weapons, fewer crafting options, no human shield grab, no silent stealth kill. While this has the doubtlessly intended effect of making Ellie feel less powerful and experienced than Joel, if you're playing a harder mode, then this is almost certainly one of the sections that will give you the most trouble, so I'll return to finish my thoughts on the game's difficulty and resource systems. There's actually another way of getting more ammo besides finding it in the world, by getting it as a drop from enemies, though this is somewhat rare, and to add to my growing list of nitpicks, they often drop ammo for guns they're not even carrying. They'll also never run out of ammo and can keep firing on you forever, then you take them down and it turns out they were only carrying 3 bullets. In any other game I probably wouldn't be mentioning this, but again The Last of Us sets itself a higher bar for realism than most, and it's impossible not to notice this contrivance while playing. Like a certain other game I've just covered on this channel that I'll be mentioning shortly, ammo drops seem to be algorithmically determined according to what you happen to be running low on at the time. The only reason these drops are a necessity is because stealth isn't an option in every encounter, and the game needs to make absolutely sure that the player has enough ammo to get through the ones that force you to use guns, usually against infected. If it wasn't for that, ammo could have been another resource like crafting materials that was just found in believable places through exploration. The crude solution Naughty Dog applied to this problem was to make most of the enemies in these forced combat scenes drop ammo whether it makes sense or not, like they all got bitten on their way back from a gun convention. It's particularly noticeable in the sewers with Henry, and then again in the winter chapter with David. You might even start to get a feel for when an enemy is about to drop ammo for you, which really harms immersion and exposes the artificiality of it all. I'm sure the devs aren't happy with this, but in order to have these climactic combat scenes in the game, they didn't have much of a choice. Did I enjoy The Last of Us more on grounded mode when I had barely any resources and was constantly forced to improvise with whatever I had, or on a lower difficulty when I had more options to experiment with and room to make mistakes? It's hard to say, but I do know that these were 2 very different experiences, and by trying to cater for both at once, actually trying to cater for 6 different possible experiences, Naughty Dog has ensured that none of them feel definitive. This is yet another consequence of their goal to achieve the broadest appeal possible, and asking the player to choose between this many options before the game even starts just doesn't seem like the right solution to me. Since it seems to be important to the devs, for the sake of accessibility I'm okay with a lower difficulty called assisted mode or something like that, but outside of that I don't see a good reason to have more than 2 others, a normal one and an extra hard one for those looking to squeeze more challenge out of the game. Really quickly, I just want to point out that The Last of Us actually has quite a lot in common with Resident Evil 4, and in many ways it feels sort of like a watered down and simplified version of that game. Now that's not necessarily a negative criticism, because The Last of Us has other ambitions besides just providing a complex gameplay experience, which is what Resident Evil 4 focuses on, but they both involve escorting NPCs, resource management and a number of combat options, with The Last of Us featuring streamlined interpretations of all of these features. It feels like it's from a completely different era of gaming, and in some ways it is, but The Last of Us first released only 8 years after Resident Evil 4, which is really not that long when you think about it, and for people looking back 50 years from now, it will seem like no time at all. Back to the story. Ellie is eventually captured by David and locked in a cage, where she discovers that he's part of a group of cannibals, and David wants to save her from the bloodthirst of the others by getting her to join them. Ellie's response is to break his finger and tell him to fuck off, which is another moment that's sure to endear her to the player. It's around this point that Joel wakes up and fights his way through David's men, mercilessly torturing 2 of them in a cutscene to find out Ellie's location. Since I'm on the topic, this seems a good spot to bring up the fact that Joel dishes out some absolutely brutal violence in this game, and it's not just restricted to cutscenes and scripted sequences. A headshot with a shotgun will cause an enemy's head to outright explode, and limbs will go flying if someone steps on a nail bomb. He can be on the receiving end of it too, with the death scene you'll see if a bloater grabs hold of you implying a particularly gruesome end just before cutting away. This hyper-violence adds to the realism of the experience in its own way, but there's no question it gets less and less effective the more you see it. The choking animation, where you can see the exact moment an enemy's brain switches off, left me kind of astonished when I first saw the detail that had been put into it, but as you've probably experienced for yourself watching this video, it loses its bite and becomes mundane over many repetitions. It seems the moral panic over violent games is well and truly behind us now, which naturally I think is a good thing, but with mass market games already looking like this, I'm curious to see how far this will be pushed in the decades to come. Anyway, the focus jumps back and forth between Joel and Ellie at this point, with Joel slaughtering everyone between him and Ellie, while unbeknownst to him she frees herself from David and escapes through the town. I like the fact that Ellie frees herself without relying on Joel here, which shows how capable and resourceful she is, and she deals with a lot of shit on her own throughout this whole chapter. This culminates in the closest thing the game has to a human boss fight, where David hunts Ellie through a restaurant and she needs to sneak behind him to stab him 3 times in the back. I do find something slightly unintentionally funny about the contrivance of this scene, as I can just picture the level designers at Naughty Dog racking their brains trying to come up with a kind of building that might realistically have a series of chest-height obstacles throughout it. That aside though, the aftermath of this boss fight is what I would consider the true emotional climax of the story, and it's where the relationship between Joel and Ellie passes the point of no return. This whole cannibal episode is probably the longest time these two have been apart from each other since they first met, and the profound relief that they both feel on being reunited here is so palpable that the dialogue was deemed superfluous and tuned out. It surely won't be lost on anyone that Joel calls Ellie baby girl in this scene, which is the same thing we saw him call his daughter Sarah 20 years ago. There really is no going back from here. Since the next chapter is the last one, I'm going to pause the story one more time and talk about the final part of gameplay that I want to mention, the downtime between combat encounters. This downtime can take a few different forms. Sometimes it's just a brief chance to look around, gather resources and collectible notes, and initiate optional conversations prompted by the environment, and I especially like that exploring side areas will often elicit some kind of dialogue or response from characters, rather than having them stand there doing nothing.
You're not gonna leave me here, right?
Just stay put.
In my favourite example, after Ellie saves Joel in the Pittsburgh hotel and he scolds her for it, you can shimmy along this ledge for a bit of optional exploration, and Ellie will actually sit on the scenery and sulk while she waits for you to come back. This is totally inconsequential, and I bet many players won't even notice it, but still the work was done to put it into the game, because Naughty Dog had the respect for the world and characters to really think about how they would act, even in small moments like this. Elsewhere, the downtime can be something slightly more involved, like one of these puzzles featuring a pallet, a plank, or a ladder, with the same solution every time. My sarcastic rendering of the word puzzle there may not be entirely fair, because these moments are never explicitly presented as something that's meant to be puzzling, but the extremely limited interactions you have with these objects makes them feel like mindless wastes of time, especially on repeat playthroughs, and the fact that you have to wait for a button prompt to appear before you can use them is just patronising. It's a safe bet that these scenes aren't really meant to challenge the player, only to provide a change of pace, and at the very least, they do accomplish that by bringing the game's forward momentum to a screeching halt. Perhaps the most important goal of these downtime moments is to give the game a chance to show the player the current state of Joel and Ellie's relationship, from distant and guarded at the beginning,
How the hell would I know?
to a deep affection by the end.
I'm gonna teach you how to play guitar.
And they are effective at doing that. The events that actually change their relationship, however, all happen during scripted cutscenes without any player involvement. While there is a very small amount of room for players to express this relationship during gameplay, or on the stick as Naughty Dog nauseatingly likes to put it, there isn't any truly meaningful interactivity to be had with it. Choosing not to give Ellie a high five by the dam does make me feel like a monster, but it doesn't really change anything. For now though, maybe that's enough. The fact that deciding whether or not to press the Y button on my controller can elicit an emotional response from me is a pretty amazing thing in itself, even if it has no consequences in the game. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it's overwhelmingly likely that the script will have the intended effect and the player will come to care for Ellie just as Joel does, but if it doesn't, then there's no real way for the player to express that, and even the most misanthropic player is railroaded to the same story conclusion. This reveals a limitation inherent to the storytelling in The Last of Us. While the player may get to control Joel and Ellie during combat sequences, they are unequivocally characters in their own right who make their own decisions independently of the player, a fact which is hammered home most strongly in the ending. This links back to what I said in the intro about the criticism of Naughty Dog being designers of movie games, and your tolerance for the gameplay cutscene structure of the game may be the deciding factor in your enjoyment of it. Following the end of the winter chapter, our final end of season transition takes us to Salt Lake City and the very final leg of the protagonist's travels, and from this point almost every sequence is the last one of its kind. This section starts with the usually talkative Ellie being despondent and ignoring Joel, the end of their journey presumably causing her to brood on its importance. Amazingly, the repetitiveness of the game's ladder puzzles actually pays off here when the dejected Ellie doesn't appear for the usual boost up to a ledge. It's a small moment, but a memorable one that injects into the gameplay some of what the characters are feeling, and I'm sure Naughty Dog is very proud of this. The following scene where the pair comes across a herd of giraffes that escaped from the city's zoo and now live in the wild ruins is an excellent one, and I particularly like that the player can sit and contemplate it for as long as they like before leaving. The world is moving on now that humanity has been forced to step aside, and in some ways, it's better off for it. I know that others have said this scene is a bit too on the nose, but in my opinion it's another one that says a lot with a little. Here, Joel also expresses his first doubts about their mission, and asks Ellie if she really wants to go ahead with it when they have the option of just returning to Tommy's dam and living however they like. Ellie is resolute, however, and wants to see it through to the end to honour all of the sacrifices that have been made up to this point. This will be important later. The final environmental exploration scene takes place next, one last chance to engage in dialogue, look for resources, and upgrade weapons. The dialogue here shows just how far the characters' relationship has come since the beginning of the game, and when Ellie hands Joel the photo of him and Sarah that she took from Tommy, he accepts it this time, demonstrating how much he's changed as well. Next up we have the final encounter with Infected, which more or less begs to be completed using stealth since it ends with two bloaters blocking the way out. It's not much different from any other Infected encounter in the game, but the size and scale of it lends it some tension, and I think it's a fitting send-off for the Mushroom Men. We're really on the final stretch now. While crossing a flooded tunnel, a bus collapses and Joel and Ellie both end up underwater. Joel grabs her and swims to safety and starts to administer CPR, only to be knocked out by fireflies and woken up inside the hospital by Marlene. It's honestly a pretty transparent excuse for the writers to separate Joel and Ellie and get them both inside the hospital, and it's one of the many things throughout the game that makes the fireflies look completely incompetent, which, as I'll get to in just a minute, I'm not sure is 100% intentional. Marlene reveals that Ellie is being prepared for surgery so that her immunity can be studied, but that she'll have to be killed in the process so that they can get access to her brain. As you can imagine, Joel's reaction to this is negative, and instead of leaving peacefully he kills his escort and then 24 other fireflies between him and Ellie. This is the game's final combat challenge, and the overwhelming number of fireflies means that it is pretty damn challenging, but being able to pick up their assault rifles to use against them is a nice touch that adds a bit of uniqueness to the fight and stops it feeling like every other in the game. Finally, Joel breaks into the operating room, murders the doctor, and just in case you haven't noticed yet how he feels about Ellie, he runs for the exit carrying her in a scene that echoes him running with his daughter way back at the beginning. This gets points for being interactive, but as I've noted already, the real changes in the characters' relationship happen in cutscenes, not in gameplay, and purely from a narrative point of view, I think the moment in Winter when Joel calls Ellie baby girl is the more important one. Still, I won't deny the effectiveness of this scene, and I don't want to take away from its achievement of saying something through gameplay. In a confrontation with Marlene downstairs, she tells Joel that Ellie would have wanted to make this sacrifice for mankind, and he visibly hesitates, perhaps recalling what Ellie said to him near the giraffes earlier, and then deciding anyway to make the choice on her behalf. Or maybe just for himself. The level of nuance captured in this short reaction shot is a pretty amazing marker of how far we've come in terms of incorporating dramatic performances into game engines. Gameplay is king for me, and I don't consider realistic graphics to be an individual selling point for any game, but it's hard not to be impressed by the apparently limitless capacity for character expression that's on display here. Knowing that Marlene can't be left alive with knowledge of Ellie's immunity, Joel executes her and leaves with Ellie.
You just come after her.
When she wakes up in the back of the car, Joel lies and tells her that the Fireflies already have plenty of examples of immune people and have failed to make a cure, giving up and having no need anymore for Ellie. Jumping forward to their arrival back at the dam, the very final scene in the game sees our perspective shift to Ellie one last time. Joel reveals himself here for the pitiable old man that he is, and the fact that we see it through Ellie's eyes drives this home even harder.
I think you really would have liked her. I know she'd have liked you.
I bet I would have.
It's interesting to me that the subtle change of which character you control in a linear scene like this can have an impact on how you interpret the dialogue. Just as they climb the last hill and look down on the lights of the dam below, Ellie stops Joel and broaches the subject of the survivor's guilt she feels, a feeling that Joel is surely no stranger to. She asks him to promise that he's telling the truth, that all the sacrifices along the way weren't made just for Joel to screw it all up at the last minute. And he does, and the credits roll. When I first saw this back in 2013, I think I was a bit too immature to really understand it, but now as a fully grown adult man uploading videos about computer games to YouTube, I found it to be a really strong ending. The big question, of course, is was Joel in the wrong here? And anyone who played the game at the original release will know that there's a lot of room for heated debate. For most of the game's runtime, it's easy to forget the high-level plot about Ellie being immune, and it almost takes a back seat to the main event of her blossoming relationship with Joel. In fact, that is literally what happens at the end, when Joel makes the call that their relationship is more important than her immunity. To him, her brain is worth more alive. The uncharitable perspective on this is that the potential salvation of mankind by Ellie's presumably willing sacrifice is prevented by a selfish man who can't bear the thought of losing everything all over again. To some, it may not even matter whether Ellie is willing or not, and the greater good might justify trading her life for countless others. If you take the Fireflies at face value, then it's difficult not to view Joel's actions as selfish and irresponsible, and the fact that he doesn't tell Ellie the truth suggests that he thinks so too. But there's reason for doubt, and the thing is, I just can't take the Fireflies seriously. We don't get much of a look into their organisation, and I think we're supposed to just take it as written that they're capable of doing what they say they are, but everywhere the player comes across them, they're in absolute shambles and can't seem to do anything right. The first time we meet Marlene, she's close to death and doesn't even have command of enough resources to securely transport Ellie, who is, as you may recall, the most important person on the planet. The Fireflies are supposedly in rebellion against the military government, but in Pittsburgh, where we see firsthand the results of the government being deposed by the people, it's now populated by bandits who murder anyone passing through and steal their shoes. And just to be clear here, I'm not saying authoritarianism is good. I'm saying that when you violently overthrow the status quo, you'd better have a damn good idea what you're going to be replacing it with. There's no evidence that the Fireflies have one. As for their attempts at researching a cure, the audio log from the doctor definitely gives the impression that he's competent, but surely in the 20 years since the outbreak there must have been plenty of attempts at producing one, and I find it hard to believe that the amateurish Fireflies would have better luck, even with Ellie in their hands. I'm left ultimately unsure of whether or not the Fireflies actually have the capacity to do what they say they want to do, and maybe that was the point in order to leave all this room for debate, but the fact that nobody in the game ever raises any of these doubts makes me suspect that we're supposed to believe they can do it. If you stop and imagine the ending going their way though, it's easy to see just how unsatisfying and anticlimactic that would have been. Perhaps Joel is right that some sacrifices are simply too great to make. In the end, the question of whether or not Joel made the right choice is kind of irrelevant, because as the player, there is no choice to be made, unless you count the choice of which gun to shoot the doctor with. Saving Ellie is the decision that Joel, or more accurately the game's writers, has made, and our only interaction with it as the audience is to try and rationalise it after the fact. That's not a bad thing. Nothing in the game up to this point should have given the player the impression that they would have any influence over the outcome of the story. We're all just along for the ride, and as long as you have no problem with that, then it's one hell of a ride and it's pretty damn well constructed. If that means that you want to call The Last of Us a movie game, then I can't argue with that, except to say that there can be such a thing as a good movie game. So that brings us to the end of The Last of Us, and as you can see, I found a lot to say about it. Going into my final thoughts on a game, I would normally give some kind of summary of what I think it's all about. And luckily for me, there's an easy way for me to do that here by giving a quick rundown of the Left Behind DLC, which I think offers a pure distillation of The Last of Us design philosophy, a perfect 2-hour vertical slice that shows you everything you need to know about this game's priorities. It's got a variety of combat scenarios, downtime scenes focused on exploring the relationship between two characters, traversal puzzles that take slightly more than 2 seconds to work out, and a subplot to discover via environmental clues and notes. I won't go into as much detail on the story here as I did with the main game, but suffice to say that it jumps back and forth between a flashback to the events that led to Ellie and her friend Riley being bitten before the events of the game, and her taking care of Joel after his collapse at the end of the Autumn chapter. Funnily enough, both of these concurrent scenes take place in shopping malls, which is surely not a coincidence, but if this has a deeper meaning then it's lost on me. Quite fittingly, considering the way the base game is similarly divided, these two halves are split between story and gameplay, one for each. I'll start with the gameplay one, which sees Ellie searching through the mall for a first aid kit to heal Joel's wound. As in the main game, Ellie has fewer combat and crafting options than Joel does. There's some combat with infected, a traversal set piece where you need to avoid the electrified water, and a passable environmental puzzle that I'm mostly just glad doesn't involve any planks. The discoverable notes and audio logs tell the tale of a group of soldiers who were stranded here and died one by one of various causes. The main event in terms of gameplay is encounters that feature both humans and infected at the same time, which was sorely missing from the base game, although with only 3 instances of it here, there's not much room to experiment with the possibilities. Luring the infected over to the human enemies and then sprinting to the exit while they distract each other is a bit too easy to do, but there's enormous potential here and I hope this is something that gets built on in the sequel. Throwing a brick to stun a human enemy so that he gets caught by the infected chasing him is a fantastic bit of emergent gameplay that I really want to see more of. One small thing I liked about this section was this statue that you first pass just after leaving the shop where Joel is hidden. The lighting on it really draws your attention and encourages you to take a good look at it, which might feel pointless since there's no way of interacting with it, but it pays off later when you loop back here at the end of the chapter via a different route, see the statue and instantly know where you are. Leading the player around in this intuitive way is hardly something unique to the DLC, or even to this game or developer, but it's just more evidence that Naughty Dog really are masters of the craft. As for the more story-focused half of Left Behind, it sees Ellie and Riley break into an abandoned shopping mall inside the Boston quarantine zone, on Riley's last night before being sent to another zone to work for the Fireflies, although this is unknown to Ellie at first. Sometime before these events, Riley, who attended the military boarding school with Ellie, disappeared without telling her why, which means that there's some tension between them, making their relationship unclear and giving the player something to try and figure out while they listen to their dialogue during the exploration segments. Believe it or not, there are actually a couple of choices to make here, including an honest-to-God dialogue selection, just the one though. I'm not too sure how I feel about this, but I think I would have preferred to just have a single script. Despite what I'll be saying in my conclusion about giving the player more interaction with the story, I don't think this is an effective way of doing that because it opens a whole can of worms of player agency. If I can choose this dialogue here, why can't I make Ellie ask more questions later, or press Riley when she doesn't answer me? These are things that I would naturally want to do, but of course there's no provision for that to happen because of how tightly scripted this game actually is, so I'd rather not be taunted by this paper-thin illusion of choice. Like I said, it only happens once, so this is a very, very minor complaint, but I really hope this feature doesn't appear in the sequel. While walking around the mall with Riley, there are plenty of environmental details to look out for, and things to interact with for optional dialogue. In fact, pretty much the entirety of this half of the DLC is just walking and talking, and building up a sense of how the characters feel about each other, neatly epitomizing a big part of the main game. As it comes to the end, it looks like Ellie and Riley are both going to get what they want, but of course we know that it has to end in tragedy, so a horde of infected appear to ruin everything, and the rest is history. Even with the brief summary of it that I've given, you can see how this DLC perfectly encapsulates everything the base game is about, and even manages to throw in a couple of tweaks to the formula that I hope to see built on in the sequel. Except for the dialogue choices, please let this be the only time that happens in the series. So, looking back at the game's design goals that I laid out at the beginning, I think The Last of Us hits a pretty high mark across the board. When it comes to realism, I may have had my fair share of nitpicks throughout the video, but that's because this game aims so high that it demands to be held to a higher standard. Contrivances for the sake of gameplay aside, the amount of thought, effort and attention to detail that went into this game and its world is absolutely staggering, both in the environments and in the way the characters react to those environments.
Shit. Yeah, not around here either.
In the gameplay department, there's no question that it successfully synthesizes the major design trends of 2013 into one highly polished package. It's got nothing you haven't seen before, but it does have a consistent drip of new options and just a sprinkling of set pieces to stop things getting too repetitive. It holds up just fine today because, by and large, the trends of 10 years ago are still the trends in 2023. All The Last of Us is missing to fit in among the latest games is an open world and climbable towers. And hey, maybe Naughty Dog is saving them for the upcoming multiplayer game. I will say that your gameplay experience can look drastically different depending on which difficulty you choose, and the full range of combat options simply aren't available to you on grounded mode, which is a shame because there are some interesting choices to be made when you're not just forced into abusing the stealth mechanics for every encounter. As for the story, it's not going to blow your mind with its originality, but I can't think of a comparable game that does character development quite as well, and on quite the scale, that The Last of Us accomplishes. In a lot of games, maybe most games, the story is just an excuse for the gameplay, a formality to create a conflict you can shoot, slash, stomp, or roundhouse kick your way through. But in The Last of Us, it's clear that telling a coherent story was at the forefront of Naughty Dog's mind right from the start, which makes the game something of a rarity. I couldn't help but grow attached to these believable characters and come to care for them just as they do for each other, and I can't wait to catch up with them and see what happens in the sequel. Perhaps my biggest criticism of the game, however, is that apart from a few rare points, the player has no real interaction with the story. To clarify, I don't think there should have been different story branches for the player to choose between. What I mean is that the characters' relationship may develop from beginning to end, but the actual gameplay remains more or less identical throughout, and we're left feeling like spectators of the story rather than participants in it. Since the story is partly about survival, I don't think it's a bad thing that there's so much combat in the game, but the story is also about the growing bond between Joel and Ellie, and practically all of this growth happens in non-interactive cinematics. Here I can repeat what I said back in the intro. While gamified combat is a language that seasoned developers are fluent in, tying complex emotions to button presses is a far more experimental art. With the majority of games featuring combat in some way, there are decades of examples to draw from and be inspired by, but the number of games that try their hand at the harder task of gamifying relationships makes for a very short list. I do seriously applaud The Last of Us for the strides it makes in this direction, and scenes like the one with the depressed Ellie not showing up for a boost really are innovative steps towards something revolutionary, but it's just not quite there in this game. The Last of Us may be a story about a relationship evolving between two people, but it's mostly a game about shooting other people in the face and watching their heads explode. Again, this could be considered another symptom of the game aiming so high that it couldn't possibly reach its full potential, and for that reason I wouldn't judge it too harshly for this. In fact, for all its flaws and shortcomings, simply by making the attempt, The Last of Us did succeed in raising the bar for every big budget game that came after it. It ended up making a bigger splash than perhaps even Naughty Dog expected, and a decade later, the ripples it created still show no sign of dying out. Make of this what you will, but when a game reaches out from the usual audience and grabs the attention of people who aren't normally into gaming, you know you're looking at a cultural milestone. I still think the Citizen Kane thing is stupid though. And yet, for all its ambition and its attempts at pushing the medium forward, the idea at the core of The Last of Us is an incredibly humble one. I keep thinking back to this concept art of Joel and Ellie laughing around a campfire, because it summarizes the experience so beautifully in one image. What simpler and more powerful concept could there be, after all, than two people growing to love each other?